those foreign ministers are meeting, but could this escalate further? And if so, how far?
Well, thank you, François, for inviting me on the show. I think that by and large, the risk of war or of some sort of armed conflict is in fact quite minimal. Venezuela hasn't had a war against a neighbor since its independence. I believe Colombia's had one almost 100 years ago. These aren't really militarized, aggressive nations. Beyond that, you have a situation where the regime in Venezuela is basically guaranteeing the FARC's participation in the current peace talks between the Colombian government and that guerrilla group that are currently taking place in Havana. So Santos's response has actually been relatively muted, giving the sort of images that we're seeing come out of a situation where Venezuela is specifically targeting very vulnerable Venezuelan residents of Colombian extraction. So the two chancellors are now meeting. The most verbal, sort of strong criticism of the Maduro regime has actually not been coming from the Colombian government per se, but from the supporters of former government Uribe, who Maduro has also blamed for being behind the supposed paramilitary incursions into Venezuelan territory.
I was going to ask you, Daniel, about the timing of all this. As you say, Venezuela instrumental in bringing those FARC guerrillas back to the bargaining table. Why is it escalating now, though, this border dispute?
So there's various sort of interpretations. I think that the one that makes the most sense to me actually has more to do with domestic Venezuelan politics than anything else. Yes, the border is very porous. It's I believe, the most heavily populated border between two South American countries anywhere on the continent. And whereas most South American borders involve very difficult to traverse terrain, the river that divides the two countries is really only about half a meter deep and maybe 10 meters wide. So it's very easy for people to cross over, and people have been crossing over for a very long time. On the Colombian side, Cucuta, which is the large settlement on the Colombian side of the border, is actually divided from the rest of Colombia by a large mountain range. So it's easier for them to get to Venezuela than it is to get to the rest of Colombia, which has been sort of a defining characteristic of that area. Now, because of that, you've had a lot of smuggling, which has been an economic drain on Venezuela, absolutely. At the same time, if seen in the context of the last year, Maduro he inherited a populist system, which was basically formulated to run on a very charismatic figure, which was that of former, now deceased President Chavez. Maduro doesn't have that charisma, and he's polling in the 20s. With a legislative election coming up December 6th. There's a sort of a tried and true Latin American, I would say, strategy in which when you have domestic problems at home that seem unassailable, you turn to an external enemy that then creates nationalist feelings that can unite the cities and the country behind the leadership. That's what we saw a little bit in Argentina in the 80s when they had their own problems that are similar to the problems Venezuela's having now: hyperinflation, human rights criticisms internationally, political prisoners, very high unpopularity. The junta started escalating the situation with the Falkland Islands and did actually manage to gain a lot of support domestically for a brief period of time. Maduro has tried to do that for 6 months with Guyana, but that hasn't really taken on. There's a long-standing territorial dispute there, and that has sort of gone out of the public eye now. And now we're seeing a new crisis escalating with Colombia, which has allowed him to declare a state of emergency and sort of draw attention away from a lot of the very high inflation, the security problems that are rampant throughout the rest of the country.
It doesn't have the charisma of his predecessor, the late Hugo Chavez. Doesn't have the same price of oil, of course. Venezuela, which relies heavily on oil revenue, and now with that price hovering below $40 a barrel this week, in how much trouble is, forget Maduro, but the whole of Venezuela?
Venezuela's in a lot of trouble. I mean, right now they're sort of living lifeline to lifeline. They've gotten some investment from Russia. They've gotten some investment from China. But these are essentially loans. They're indebting themselves further to try and sort of wait out the period of low oil prices. Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez was elected, oil was actually at around $18 a barrel. So it got very high during Chavez's rule, which is when you started seeing a lot of the social programs that were made possible by the elevated oil rents. and which is actually one of the things that drew a lot of the Colombians into Venezuela in the first place, because the social programs in place on the Venezuelan side of the border, the subsidies were much better. The area, as I said, on the other side of the border tends to be very separated from the Colombian, sort of the Colombian central power, so there wasn't a lot of services there. And as a result, it was something that was even welcomed by Chavez, who actually gave voting rights to a lot of the Colombians who would cross, and then they would usually vote for Chavez, who had legitimized their role there in the first place. Now that they've become a potential sort of enemy, we're seeing an interesting phenomenon where Maduro is basically channeling his inner Trump. He's trying to sort of regain populist credibility by blaming a lot of the problems that are much larger than an immigration problem on immigrants. And we're also seeing, I like to tell my American friends, a sort of a slow motion image of what it would be like to have sort of a Trumpian immigration policy in place. You have families that are being split apart. You have essentially no process. You have 6 constitutional rights that have been suspended, and nobody knows for how long. And the fact that the process is being done so quickly is escalating the sort of the human costs of this entire ordeal.
So what does your crystal ball then tell you about what's going to happen in those December elections?
Well, I think that's the 100 million Bolivar question, which would be less than $1 million. It's essentially what we're looking at is the Chavismo is weaker right now electorally than it's ever been. And usually the best predictor in legislative elections in Venezuela's history has actually been presidential popularity, because the president tends to take an outsized role that's very much transcends the party. Nobody calls the government party the government party. They call it Chavismo because it's based on this figure. And as a result of that, the fact that Maduro is personally unpopular weakens him. Now, the fact that they control the courts actually makes it a little bit easier for them to have some wiggle room. So, for example, they've managed to deny a lot of opposition, at least 9 opposition candidates so far, the right to run. They also came up with a last-minute change in the electoral laws, or in the electoral specifications, so that opposition candidates would have to be half men, half women, which was something that Chavismo was in a much, who were able to see it coming, was in a much better place to capitalize on. Whereas the opposition, which had already essentially figured out who would be running where, was forced to go back to the drawing board, and it caused a lot of tension finding out now that a lot more women were going to be involved. What would happen with all the people who had been sort of assured within the extant party system of the united opposition that they would have a seat or a potential run at the electoral legislature.
Daniel Lansberg-Rodriguez, one final question for you. You mentioned earlier how many of those being expelled from Venezuela are recent arrivals, but there are those who've been there for decades, and that's a reminder of the high stakes of this peace process with the FARC. What's going to happen to those people if there is a deal?
Well, if there is a deal, it's the fact is that I've been having a lot of conversations throughout this week with people on the ground in sort of the Táchira area, and on the Colombian side, everybody says that this feels different, fundamentally different from previous times when the border's been closed. Most notably, probably in 2008, when there was sort of an escalating argument over the sort of Colombian incursions into Ecuador to attack FARC leaders. Caused a diplomatic crisis with both Ecuador and Venezuela for the Uribe administration. What we're seeing now is that the actual people who are invested or who have businesses that sort of are based on crossing the border, at least legal businesses, 70% of those have essentially disappeared over the last several years, or the last 2 or 3 years. Even in previous months, you've had a lot of expulsions of Colombians. What's different now is that they're a lot more dramatic and they're a lot faster. They've expelled in about 3 days about 2/3 of the number of Colombians that they expelled in the 12 months previous. And unlike in the past, there was no process. So right now, the ball is very much in Santos's court, insofar as making sure that there are basically organizations and that there is enough of a state presence in place on the other side of the border to be able to facilitate the reintegration of these Colombians who've lost everything, not just physically, but also a lot of their network, a lot of their sort of operating the people that they know, their environment. They need to find a way to integrate into Colombia in a new way. And that's something that's going to be a real challenge for the government. And the government right now is very sort of single-mindedly following the FARC negotiations. That is their number one priority. Santos has about 30% approval rating, which is much less than sort of the norm for his predecessor, Uribe. And he's placed a lot of his sort of credibility on these talks. So he won't do anything that would escalate things with Venezuela, but that doesn't mean that he can't do something to facilitate this entire situation. And it was problematic. It was troubling to see that he has not yet been to the border himself, sending the interior minister and the chancellor. I think that this is a problem that is large enough, that the human costs are great enough that it requires sort of more direct presidential attention than what we've seen so far, if he's going to maintain credibility with those people.
All right. We'll see if the president does make the trip. Daniel Lansberg-Rodriguez of geopolitics consultants Greenmantle, thank you for joining us on France 24.
Thank you so much for having me, François.